Welcome to the Fire Nuggets Framework Podcast with Jay Bonnifield and me, Nick Papa. Our intent is tapping into expertise to capture tangible fireground takeaways. By interviewing experienced professionals, we aim to extract their tacit knowledge and intuitive judgments to provide you with a better understanding of the fireground and actionable insights to apply to your next fire. For the third episode, we are joined by our guest, James Johnson, an acting lieutenant with the Vancouver Fire Rescue Services in British Columbia, Canada. Before getting on the job, James completed his apprenticeship in technical training to become a Red Seal journeyman carpenter. James is a master instructor for the IAFF's Fireground Survival Program, a technical panelist for FSRI's study on fire dynamics and firefighting tactics in multi-story residential structures, and is a contributor to NIOSH's Firefighter Fatality Investigation Program. Welcome to the show, James.
Awesome. Thanks for having me, guys.
It's our pleasure. So let's kick this off. I consider building construction, along with fire dynamics, to be the foundation upon which strategy and tactics are framed. Yet the topic is not given a fraction of the attention it deserves. On top of that, it has been plagued by overgeneralizations and misconceptions. What is your take on this systemic problem, and how have you aimed to correct it through your work?
Yeah, great question. I think the building construction topic's an interesting one because, like you mentioned that we don't put enough time into it in a lot of places. But on the flip side of that, the time that we do put into it is not necessarily, in my belief, focused in the right direction. Like, a lot of traditional building construction curriculums are, here's the 5 types of construction, and then here's an example of the worst case scenario that's ever happened in that type of construction, and then send them on their way. Or else we just bury people with details of every connection, fastener, and so much stuff that's not applicable to somebody pushing a hallway or searching or cutting a hole in the roof. So I think my perspective on it's changed a lot over the years. Initially, when I first started, I've been teaching about it for about 10 years now. And I think when I first started out, it was much more of like a traditional kind of approach to it. But as I've become more experienced in it, and I've started stripping the layers down a lot, and we were talking before we went on air. It's a big part of it for me is like, what can firefighters take away? Like, give them some applicable information and then be able to take away and apply it tomorrow when they're on the rig. And that's kind of the lens that I view it through now. Like, what are the critical things that we need to know to do our job, and try to limit some of the noise of all this additional stuff that we don't need to. And if you want to totally geek out about it, you can start going down those rabbit holes. That's great. But for the vast majority of what we do, there's a kind of a framework for that to look at for what we can do, and then the kind of the information that we need in the moment. But there's a lot of noise and a lot of stuff out there that I just don't think is applicable, especially when you look at the fire service now, like how much stuff we have to do. Like, if you're with a smaller organization and you have to do all the different specialties and disciplines, and you're switching between an engine and a truck, and there's just so much information that we have to try to wrap our heads around. How can we distill the construction stuff so it's meaningful in the moment, especially when you factor in the high stress environment and trying to make rapid decisions under those conditions? Like, what's the easiest way that we can formulate it? I always kind of think about, one of my favorite quotes is Albert Einstein, like, everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. Like, I always kind of think about that through that lens now of how can we distill it down.
Absolutely. So when it comes to the narrative fallacies, which kind of make that simple, is the stories that have been told over the years about building construction, which also kind of goes hand in hand with some fear mongering, which some of it was, or most of it was unintentional, for that manner. But when it comes to lightweight and truss construction, they're most certainly at the top of that list. So while, again, we could all agree that the messaging was well intended, I think a good portion of it was not entirely accurate, or at least not backed up by any legitimate empirical data. So can you shed some light on the controversy surrounding those topics based off of your actual expertise in the building construction industry, and then how it's been validated?
Yeah, I think there's multiple parts to that. I think one of them is lumping all lightweight components together. Like even like especially when we talk about trusses, like a floor truss and how that reacts under fire conditions and a roof truss are very different. Just the way that the fire dynamics work, the way the fire builds, the way that it gets eaten away, the things that we have on top of the decking. Like in a floor system, you have things that don't allow that burn through that we see in a roof. So I think some of it comes from that, kind of lumping everything together. And then also just not understanding the actual failure modes of these things. Like all of us, I'm sure, have heard like if one truss fails, the whole roof fails. And that's just not not demonstrated in 99.9% of roof failures. And that's just due to the way that it's sheathed, the overlapping of the 4x8 sheets and things like that. Um, and so I think, it's a little bit maybe broken telephone, like things that were, like you can read early textbooks, like even the earliest editions of Brannigan's, and it'll say if one truss member fails, the whole truss can fail. And then, you extrapolate that over a couple generations and it gets um, changed or, the broken telephone. I also think some of that might come from, you think about like early truss, like heavy for a heavy wood frame truss design, like you have 16 feet, 20 feet between trusses often. So if you lose one truss, you have a 32 to 40 foot hole in the roof. That's a big problem. But with the lightweight trusses and the spacing being much more close together and there being way far more redundancy built into the system that you don't see those catastrophic failures that you did in some of those other types. So I think that's kind of some of it. There's certain things too, like people talk about gusset plates popping off because of heat, and that's just not really the reality of it. It's a lot of times with a truss roof and with gusset plates, the structural members start to move out of plane. So they'll be in their vertical position, they start to shift, and now those shifting forces are what cause gusset plates to pop off. And there's just little things like that where it's slight just misunderstanding of the actual failure modes have just turned this, kind of spun it out of control in some ways. But I think it's like also important to understand that like any lightweight system is going to fail faster than a conventional system. It's just understanding like the strengths and weaknesses and understanding how to read these conditions. Like, take a lightweight framed roof with lightweight trusses, like unless you have tile on the roof, um, vast majority of the time you're going to get burn through of the decking in between, and then that leads to instability of the roof, and then that leads to a progressive collapse through there. So there's certain things that we can look for and see, and I don't like to say predict. I like to say reduce uncertainty. There's certain ways that we can reduce that uncertainty by looking for those signs.
Right.
To
And
have a little bit more, in your opinion, James, like Fields always talks about, working from probability to possibility, right? And that's kind of one of his main things when it comes to talking about hose stuff. And I think a little bit with the building construction, I think you probably use that same concept with the building construction of like you use the term of 99% of the time this is what it's gonna do, and we kind of get hung up on like, well, there are the 1%, and like, well, with grappling with the reality of our job that you know we got to kind of go all in on the probability of what's going to happen, and then we have to like kind of be I don't know how to put it exactly in a way that's not callous, but like there is the 1%. There's always going to be that 1% chance of whatever worst case scenario happening. Like within that, do you have any thoughts on how you navigate that, probability and possibility? Like are you kind of um, you know, building your framework around the probability and then reconciling the possibility with like, hey, this is just kind of what I signed up for, is there's always going to be that chance, or how do you grapple with that?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I actually, in most of my presentations, have Aaron's quote as a slide in the presentation because I really believe that. And like going back to talking about the traditional building construction curriculums, a lot of it is like that um, those abnormal circumstances that happen. That's the example that's used a lot of times. And I think that's really that question really is what helped me kind of you like develop or come up with the framework that I use for building size up. Because if like every material fails predictively, like there's, wood fails in a predictable way, steel does. It all has these like predictable failure modes. So it really comes down to understanding the construction type. And then like the whole system that I kind of use for that is based around having an understanding of what the types of materials are in there. And then you can start to reduce that uncertainty by, you know, understanding what the fire is going to do to those components if it does reach them.
Yeah, one thing that will come up from time to time, not to segue us too much here, but yeah, like the a ridge beam versus a trussed roof without a ridge beam, right? Well, like with a truss roof, lightweight truss roof, where we've got sheets of OSB or our decking coming together, right? And you got that heat build up at the top of the triangle, and like you said, the knowing where to look on those roofs, like you got your ridge vent or your gap there between the sheeting, and where you don't have like a um, traditional ridge beam up there, where like maybe that traditional ridge beam that was a really strong spot of that roof in a older house, or if it's a newer house that's built with a true ridge beam versus a trussed roof without that. Just knowing the difference between the two of those may dictate how you're going to travel, as opposed to just, hey, it's a peaked roof, get up on top and start traveling the ridge. I don't know if that's something that like you try to point out in your classes, or if you have any thoughts on that for folks.
Yeah, I think one of the big things is like the kind of the framework that I use for size up begins with identifying the era of the building. So understanding like the approximate age, and there's three different era categories that we use. But if you start to understand like every era range has predictable materials that are going to be used, and if you can kind of narrow that down, then you can understand some of those strengths and weaknesses. And like people talk a lot about lightweight truss collapses versus conventional collapse, but a lot of that, like the vast majority of that, has to do with the decking material and the sheathing. Like modern construction, we're using 3/8 OSB or plywood for our decking. If in modern stick frame roof or conventionally framed roofs that are using 3/8 OSB, you're going to have similar failure modes in it because it's that decking or that diaphragm system that holds the whole thing together. So, um, yeah, a big part of it is if you can understand the era and relate that to the types of materials are used, then you can start to have a prediction or understanding of how much time you may have or what those failure modes will be if they were to occur.
James, just to kind of springboard off of the broken telephone analogy you had made earlier with some of this information too. And I think a lot of it is taken out of context as well too, or we're not taking into consideration the time component. I think even not just speaking in lightweight construction terms, but even some of the more famous bowstring truss collapses. The two that stick out in my head are the Wall Bombs fire or the Hackensack, New Jersey fire, where you know those uh, those fires were burning for a prolonged period of time before the collapses occurred. So I think
Mm.
that is often left out of the narrative as well too when you're considering how much direct flame impingement those systems were undergoing before they actually experienced their failure.
Yeah, you're totally right because like just to take Hackensack for example, and we'll leave out the whole discussion of true bowstring versus arch truss. But Hackensack, like the underside of the truss, like the bottom cord was loaded with basically used for storage, which is a truss is not designed to have the top cord loaded in that manner. And then I believe with Hackensack, it was like the initial lines were 1.5 inches, and there was like up to 30 minutes without water flowing into the space where the fire was. If you look at all the timelines and everything that's out there. So, those are some, contributing factors. If you have an old truss that's loaded in a way that it's not intended to be, and that it has fire impingement for that long, that's a predictable failure in my mind. Um, but you have to be able to not understand, but be able to identify all those kind of key elements, right? It's a tragedy, and but there's lots of examples like that where sometimes we're focusing so much on it being a truss and less focus on it being, maybe some of the other components that came into play in that particular fire.
Yeah, and I think
Well,
that's just
such a go ahead,
yeah,
Nick.
that's why it's so critical to understand like why context is so important, and understanding how the systems work, and also the things that are at play here, because time is always our immortal enemy. And especially when we're talking, building construction and some of these truss and lightweight systems, that's the piece that we got to put into play here too. So we can now frame that into what we were talking about of probability versus possibility, because now instead of just blanket telling people don't trust the truss, which again, so well intended, and I'm not knocking anybody who was trying to do the right thing by passing along that information, but it's like, yeah, you can be suspect of it, but let's put it in the context of the whole situation, look at it holistically. I think that's the thing we're trying to get across to people.
Hmm. And I think like an important part of the discussion here too is like both of you guys teach and are out there, doing that sort of stuff. And I think as like anyone who's an instructor or passes on information, like you have a big responsibility to be careful with what you say, right? And you can talk about all of this stuff with lightweight construction, but you guys had Dr. Preston Klein on, which I'm a huge fan of. But like he always talks about like what does right look and feel like and what does wrong look and feel like. And it's like you have to add that into the context too. It's like you can talk about all of this stuff, but we really have to rely on our senior members to be able to pass this information on. Like what does right look and feel like and what does wrong? I always use the example like I was doing a class in California, kind of in the Bay Area, and we were doing these walkthroughs with tilt up construction that had a panelized wood roof, which is a very kind of southern U.S. Southwest U.S. roof system. But you could go; it was a 1 million square foot warehouse, and we were going up on the roof, and I was showing the guys I could bounce on the roof, and I could make the 8 other guys that were on the roof actually move just from my weight of bouncing on it. And that is normal. That's a normal system. So, sometimes when we talk about being on a roof and we mix up the words or interchange the words springy or spongy, it's like we have to actually show people what right looks and feel like. That's a normal roof under perfect conditions. And then what does a roof that's not under those perfect conditions? I think it was last year at Firemanship, Brian and Ian and the Irons and Ladders guys, they actually built a big truss roof. They burnt it out and they were giving the guys the opportunity to sound it. So it's like, this is what a roof sounds like when, decking's compromised or the trusses are compromised, and you give them that real life feedback of, here's what it is rather than just talking about it. So, I think it's important to provide people the information from it, but we also have to back that up with showing them, like I said, like what does right look and feel like, what does wrong look and feel like.
Right. What you were talking about earlier with, like the prolonged delay of water and all that kind of stuff is a contributing factor to some of these. Just that the fire ground is a series of interconnected systems that are, kind of reliant on each other. And that anytime there's a failure of one of those systems, it's a kind of, which we'll talk about like the clusters and anomalies and stuff later. But, there's a lot of layers to that, like you're talking about with prolonged lack of water. And, would you have that same failure without it? Like the answer is probably no. And so not distilling things down you want to be as simple as possible, but not simpler, right? Like you can simplify it too much to where you're distilling away, don't trust the trust. Like, well, that wasn't on the trust there. That was on, failure to recognize the decking failing before or whatever it was. So,
Hmm.
which in the building construction, I think a lot of times within those interconnected systems, the building construction is what takes the fall for, like, you blame the building,
Hmm.
right? And like, well, it's not that simple more often than not.
Yeah. And then you add on to it too. Like this is something that's getting a little bit more airtime right now, but is like, Bresler and Leadership Under Fire talk about it, like the whole concept of human factors, right? Like a lot of times it's like we either blame the building or we blame the individual firefighter who may have, you know, whatever the circumstances, went through the floor, went through the roof. But we also have to think about like that human factor perspective of it, and being oversaturated with stress and all the things that come along with that, and how that affects the cognitive ability to recall all of this information. So again, trying to bring it back to that most simplest form.
Yeah, and that's the whole intent of what we're doing with this podcast is we're really working from a lot of Gary Klein's work and what MCTI is doing in LUF and but this idea of trying to build these mental frameworks in people's heads, like in Jay kind of alluded to already, and where he's going to walk this conversation later on is, having that baseline of what right looks like. Then with that, you can easily recognize the anomalies, and then by understanding how everything works, you can match the patterns, you can chunk information, and then, you can use that thin slicing, if you will, to make more concise decisions because you're just able to group everything and very quickly in your brain if when you know how all these things work together. I think that's critical, and that's what we're really trying to go with all these different topics.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. That's just how my brain works for that stuff. I have to formulate it in that way if I'm gonna be able to have it be useful in any way.
Well, I think when you start really diving into the neuroscience and what the acute stress does to the body and our cognitive capabilities, it, it's a really a necessity. We have to make sure that we're understanding these things systematically and how everything's intertwined because as you said, when you go undergo these high levels of stress and you start reverting back to that lizard brain,
Yeah.
it's biology is working against you and for a lot of these things, and we got to make sure that we're setting ourselves up for success and not only being able to manage just the stress but also making sure that we have an understanding that we can still tap into and be able to make sound decisions despite all these factors working against us.
Yeah, and like some people push back too when you bring up the idea of like frameworks or having systems, or there's pushback about acronyms and mnemonics and that sort of stuff, and like all of this stuff is super important, but you have to look at it under the lens again, to go back to Preston Klein, where he talks about like offloading cognition into habit. It's like that's the whole
Yes.
point of having these frameworks and stuff, is like you want that framework and something that you study and work, and but you eventually want that to turn into habit. Like like with the way that I look at a building, I don't have to really cognitively put too much like energy into that now, because it's something that I've been surrounded by for a long time, and it just comes in a natural way. So I can focus on, the other dozen things I'm going to mess up at the fire, but and not really focus on that, right?
Yeah, I think it's all about the creating that automaticity and you know the less cognitive bandwidth that we're using, the better. And if we can keep things in the forefront of our minds, that it's that second nature, and we don't have to we don't need um, that high level of thinking or that deep thought in order to make sense of it all. That this is just we know it so well that it's second nature, and we can respond automatically instead of having to go through this
Yeah.
hardcore mental process that you're just not going to have the capacity for in the moment most of the time.
Yeah, well,
Yeah.
like
You're not. Go ahead, James.
Well, I was just gonna say, like, you guys are both grapplers. Like think about it in like from a jiu-jitsu perspective, right? Like in your early time, like as a white belt, you're constantly focused on, every little thing of how to do it. And then as you progress through, now all of those things are just, second nature. You're not thinking about it. And, you're thinking a couple steps ahead of how you can get ahead of the problem. And that's really the same thing we want to do here is make all these, use these frameworks to be able to think 3 steps ahead without putting that energy into some of the other stuff.
Dude, it's such a good analogy. Like I wish everybody could experience that at some point, see the crossover with it, with the what we do on the fireground stuff with that. Cause like, yeah, when you start out as a white belt and you're just trying to trying to survive, it's like even if you're devoting so much conscious thought and effortful thought towards something that you're missing limited windows of opportunity because by the time you recognize and process it, like that window's gone and you're getting smashed or whatever. And then as you grow and stuff becomes more intuitive, and just like you were talking about with Preston's offloading of cognitive function, like you're flowing, you're not you're just kind of reacting and you're moving through stuff and you're capturing these windows as you feel them open. It's more like intuition driving things, and which then allows your cognitive bandwidth to be then devoted towards being a step or two ahead, which is ultimately the goal of like your framework on the fireground, is to be in that capacity where you're able to work a step or two ahead because you're the step that you're currently in, you're kind of intuitively flowing through. You're not having to devote as much conscious effortful thought. So
Yeah, and I kind of had a little bit of an aha moment this past year. Like I recently promoted, and I was doing a bunch of travel and different projects, so I wasn't going to jiu-jitsu as much. And the biggest thing that I noticed is like my timing was all off and I had to think about things way more. And I was
yeah.
like, relating that back to work. It's like you have to be constantly thinking about this stuff and using it regularly for it to keep that, cognition as habit sort of thing. It's not something you
Yeah.
just kind of do once, focus on it for a while, and then you never have to think about it again. It's something you have to be constantly using to keep that sharp. So
Yeah, and I think that the other perfect analogy to that too is, if you go on vacation and you're off the map for like a week or two, and there's a very short window where this is the case. But Dr. Klein also talks a lot about residue too, which I also kind of lump into this, where when you're going consistently, especially if you have different professors and you're learning new moves or new things, and you're trying some new things. Sometimes we kind of junk our brains up with all this new information, and we're trying too hard. But then you take a week or two off, and then you come back, and what do? You revert to your game, and
mhm.
Yeah.
you have this clean slate with no residue lurking around, and it's all just intuitive movement. Like you're playing your game without any other distraction. And I feel like that's really what is like another perfect analogy for all this is when you just have like you said, a simple framework that's just simple enough, and we just hammer on that. That's when we can keep that aperture open, and we can again recognize those anomalies, recognize, capture those opportunities, and seize those advantageous opportunities, or again, pivot if we need to before things start to go sideways. That's the real secret sauce there.
Yeah, absolutely.
So James, let's dive into your framework here. So one of the questions uh, written out for you here was about the Firefighter One curriculum and how it leaves a lot to be desired when it comes to the building construction. And so the kind of thread we are going to pull on was how instructors can fill the gaps for folks in the initial academy setting and progressively after they graduate and go out on the streets. Like if you're going to provide an initial framework to somebody starting out, there's a lot of times in these academies, it's going to be like, hey, go read this, building construction component or chapter or whatever it is. It's going to load them with a bunch of information and a lot of it out of context. How do you contextualize it? Like what framework would you give to somebody who's starting out right out of the gate?
So before I get into it, there's one like kind of key component that so most building construction curriculums based off the 5 types of construction. And what really made me shift my perspective on it was I'm involved in the building codes in both Canada and the US, being part of technical committees and helping write code in a lot of ways. And what we see like more and more is building codes have shifted to be performance based, meaning like it gives way more opportunity for engineers and architects to use what we call alternative means and methods. So if a building, say a type 2 non-combustible building, which would mostly be steel and concrete, if an engineer or a designer wants to use some wood components in there, if they can prove equivalency through alternative means and methods, they have the ability to do that now. So what that's done is really over the last like 15 years is shifted buildings that they don't fall into those 5 types of construction cleanly anymore. So that was kind of one of the first things that made me start to think about it from a little bit of a different perspective. And then the second part of that is, we teach our people that, a type 5 wood frame, this is what we have. And then if I have a wood frame building built in 1905 and I have one that was completed in 2025, yes, they're technically a type 5 and they're wood frame, but they're completely different structures and, orientation, the types of materials, they all share the same raw material of wood, but that's kind of where the similarities stop. So those are kind of some of the things that made me really think about it a bit more under a different lens. So the way that I've kind of formulate it, and I really think this is a really great way for new people to look at it, like new learners, and then you can just enhance it further as you have more experience and understand it. But it basically, when we look at a building, it starts with 3 parts. So the main parts are you looking at the era. You want to understand what the materials are, and then you want to know what the use is or the occupancy of the building. So when you look at the era, if you look across buildings all across Canada and the United States, you can break buildings into 3 categories. So we have pre-war, which is right up until from the first buildings that were ever built right up until the 1940s. Post-war is kind of mid 1940s up to the 1970s. And then modern buildings are 1970s and above until current day. And what these 3 classifications do is they group buildings into, sometimes technological advances that happened, like in the modern era with engineered and lightweight components. Or if you look at the post-war era, it was really like a social thing. There was a ton of people coming back from war. All of our natural resources were being put into the war efforts. And so they had to build really smaller, more efficient homes with the big housing boom. So, and it doesn't matter if you're East Coast, West Coast, in the Midwest, it all applies. The buildings might look slightly different, but they all kind of fall into these categories. And then it gets into the materials, and the materials is directly related to the era. So I'll just give a couple examples. If you have a wood frame house, like a single family house that we would say is pre-war, well, right away, based off the era, I know that's going to be full dimensional structural members. I know it's going to be stick framed. If it's pre-war and it's multi-story, I know it's going to be balloon frame. I know you're going to have those knee wall challenges. It's going to be lath and plaster. All of those things are directly dictated right by the era. So that's kind of the method is you look at the era and then you start to look at the materials, and then the materials break down. Modern era, you're going to have lightweight materials. You're going to have trusses, and lightweight materials means that we can build bigger compartments. So then you have vaulted ceilings and you have open concept design. All of those things, all those arrangements are all dictated by the materials. And then the last thing is the use. And use is like, is it residential or is it commercial? And if it's residential, is it single family or multifamily? And if it's commercial, what is it used for? And so that was a 3-minute breakdown of it, but that's kind of the framework of it, where I can look at a building and get a rough estimate of the era. And all the buildings in these era ranges have a specific look to them. And what I always encourage people to do is go onto a real estate website in your area, And every real estate website gives you the option to put in the dates that you want to look for. So you can go from no minimum up to 1945, and it'll only show you how buildings that are for sale in your area that fall into that date range. And all you just scroll through the pictures and you start to build that mental model of what a pre-war building looks like in your area. Then you do the same thing for the post-war and the modern era, and then you start to develop it. And it's to the point where if people do it a bit, you can drive down a street in your town or city and go, pre-war, post-war, modern, modern, modern. And it becomes the kind of that second nature just based off that mental model idea of understanding it. I don't know if that makes
I like
sense.
No, that it makes a ton of sense. And I like how you know, even threw in there like, hey, that's a, 3-minute summary of this. But really, I mean, if a framework's going to be usable in the field, it's kind of got to be able to be described that way, in a very succinct way that's easy to use. Like, of course, it's so much more complex than that, the depth of it. And in order to like really get good at using something that's been simplified, you've got to go, you've got to know the depth to it and all that. You can't just have a cursory knowledge of it, but you've got to be able to simplify it in that, that simple, usable way where you can just kind of intuitively see a building and understand like here's the baggage that comes with this building, pre-war, post-war, modern, whatever. Like here's the strengths, here's the weaknesses, here's the essentially here's the cluster that this fits into, and pros and cons to it or whatever, strengths and weaknesses, timing, protection, all that kind of stuff. And you got to be able to quickly like look at it and visualize it and know this is all the baggage that comes with that era building, right?
Yeah. And then to go back a little bit to the material part of it, like in North America, we build buildings out of wood, steel, masonry, and concrete. That's the four elements. There's some hippies that build hay bale houses, and probably around where not too far from you, Jay,
That's right.
and up here. And then you get the tech geeks that'll do the 3D printed houses, but those are, again, the tiny, tiny percentage. The vast majority is wood, steel, masonry, and concrete. And then based off the era, there's, kind of sub-classifications where, if we talk about masonry in the pre-war era, it's unreinforced masonry. That's kind of our big concern for that. Once you get into post and modern, all masonry is reinforced in some way. So, it's just, again, it all ties back to that era range from it.
Do you have any, James, you got any examples of this? Is just kind of something I was thinking about while you were talking there, but any examples of fires you've been on or anything where you've kind of found some benefit from clustering buildings in that way and whatnot, where does anything stick out in your mind of like, oh yeah, this one fire, this one time, like this was really helpful it solidified this concept for me?
Yeah, I think the big one, because I've predominantly worked in our kind of older area. And so for me, it's that balloon frame, like being able to identify it as pre-war. Like, you even just anything, like if you're a third or fourth in rig, like coming in and you see that it's a pre-war and you're going to be helping, the engine check for extension or overhaul, like, you're in for a lot of work with the lath and plaster. But really that's a big one for me, is being able to identify those pre-war homes and identify the vertical fire spread that you're going to get through the balloon frame. That's kind of the one where it's been really useful. And then same with the apartment buildings, like condos, like most of them are going to be post-war or modern, and you're going to have very different challenges in those two. And that's just something you take a snapshot from the street, and you're going to have an idea of where you may be chasing it if it does extend from the compartment into the void space. um, I find it, yeah, like it can be very, very useful in multiple ways. And even like, Jay, coming from an engine perspective, like, if you look at a house and it's pre-war, or if it's post-war, we don't have those engineered materials. So it's going to be much more compartmentalized in the inside. The stretch is going to be a little bit different. If you have a modern home, as you identify it, you're probably going to have a wide open concept, half the house, or as Jordan Legan says, like the public and the private side of the house, like that public side in the modern is most likely going to be a wide open space. And whether you're searching or you're flowing, like, all of that stuff it's not just, not just applicable to the construction. You can think about it in other ways as well.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up Jordan too, because he's one that we would love to have on the podcast too, because his wayfinding and smoke class is tremendous.
Yeah.
He talks about, again, this is using terminology from other industries that's already in existence, where he's got that architecture background.
Hmm.
There's the term fenestrations for the exterior building features, namely like windows or vent and soil pipes, that sort of thing, where you can use those exterior features to help you not only determine the era, but also it can lend a lot of insight into the layouts of these buildings, and like he says, differentiating between public versus private. So now you can. I always tell my guys that the idea is to create that mental blueprint in your mind of the layout, and so you can not only use it for what you're talking about, which is determining the era, and which will lead into the materials, but also for what Jordan talks about too, which hopefully we'll get into with him, which is determining layout, which is this is all going to give us tremendous intel and allow us to better operate in these buildings.
Yeah, absolutely. Jordan's class is amazing, and he's a friend of mine, and I've spent a lot of time through text and on the phone with him as I was, kind of building out a lot of these ideas. He's definitely contributed to a bunch of it. And I think the difference between like the way that I look at the building versus like Jordan narrows it down further based off the different floor plan typology. Where like when I'm thinking about this, especially in the error ranges, those three error ranges, it's like how are those error ranges, or how is the building going to, what's the possible failure modes, and what's the possible fire spread that's going to happen. And that's where it breaks it down into those big chunks that you think about. And especially when you think about it from how is it directly related to me, pushing down the hallway or getting up on a roof, like those are the things that's, how is it going to potentially collapse, and how's that fire going to spread through those spaces.
Which I think that's a good segue into the next question here about your personal size up process and how folks out there can kind of improve their own. So yeah, like you said, you're looking at where's like spread avenues of spread and all that kind of stuff. So can you kind of walk us through the James Johnson like personal size up process and what you use in the field?
Yeah. So it definitely begins with the era. Like I basically, when I hop off the rig, I'm looking at the era of the building. I'm going to put it into one of those categories. When we're talking, let's just use residential for an example. If it's residential for the especially single family, like, that vast majority of the time, it's going to be wood as the materials. And then based off the era, I'm going to understand if it's balloon frame, if it's platform frame, if I have drywall, if I have lightweight components, all that stuff is going to be dictated by the era. And then a big thing for us is that use category. Like in Vancouver, if you have a house over, 2,500 square feet, there's probably 6 to 8 individual living units in that building. So that would be, something that I would classify as a multifamily. Um, and looking at that, and then I'm looking at thinking about the fire spread. Did it start in the compartment and has it extended into a void space? Then from there, I'll go back to my materials and my era, and that'll help me understand, if it's lightweight and modern, I'm going to have much more horizontal fire spread between that floor system, say for an example. And that's kind of the basis where I start it from is, like what is the building? How is that going to come into play? And then trying to have a sense of, where's the fire at? And I know Jay, actually, I think I heard the BAG it acronym from you for the first time. And I put that into the context of construction. Like, where's the fire been? Did it start in a compartment? Where is it at? Did it breach a void space, or did it go up the exterior into the attic space? And then where is it going based off those materials? How is it going to travel within in that void space? So I kind of think about it in that way, like what's my building, and then kind of bag the fire as far as, where it's going within the construction materials.
Yeah, when you and I were kind of having a discussion about that, and just the thought popped in like as I was texting back and forth with you and kind of processing what you're saying. I was like, boy, James, it sounds like he's telling the story of the fire. Like when you're, you know, using bag or, banat going or whatever, and you're coupling it with the era of the building, like you're really like telling the story of the fire, where it's been, how it got there, where it's going to head, and then which is pretty much going to tell you the story of how to deal with it, right?
Yeah. And it also, like, understanding kind of the bin at going is that's your main way of reducing that uncertainty of collapse, is like is really understanding it. Like if you can understand the materials and the systems that are used, and you have an idea of the fire dynamics portion of it and where the fire is spread, like you can keep yourself out of a bad situation by avoiding those positions, or getting ahead of the fire, when we talk about like the vertical fire spread, for example.
Yeah, and I think that's huge too, is understanding the bag and the importance of it too lends to it the strategic aspect of the firefight. And particularly when it comes to like balloon frame construction or ordinary construction, you really have to, this is where it comes into like, resources needed in committing the necessary people to get to that leading edge of the fire to be able to cut it off. I think that's a huge component of this. And I know, Jay, you and I have talked about this a lot, and kind of our frameworks for rolling up, and particularly like this as it pertains to engine company operations. But we've discussed like our personal framework would be using that bag and using the building construction is, first off, is this an exterior fire of origin or an interior fire of origin? Because we deal with a lot of rear porch fires on a lot of our
Hmm.
deckers and 3 and 4 story ordinaries. That's a bread and butter fire for us. So again, for me, it's ruling out, hey, was this a exterior fire that is now making its way inside, or is this a compartment fire, or fire that started inside the building? And then
Hmm.
once you have that, one of my big concerns too is always want to, once I figured that out, now it's immediately ruling out the basement fire. I always kind of like am under the mindset of every fire started in the basement until I prove otherwise with my initial size up, because that's for us, you could have fire presenting from an upper floor, upper space, and it could have started in the basement because of the open stud channels or the open wet walls that go from basement all the way up. So
Hmm.
for me, that's kind of that initial sequence of figuring those few things out, and then looking at, okay, how is the fire going to spread with these void spaces? And now, strategically, you now need to get the resources not only to get water on the seat of the fire, but now you have to get to that leading edge too, to cut off that vertical extension and that lateral extension as well.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, the like interior versus exterior seated, like especially in the wood frame apartments and all that kind of stuff, like that's predominantly what we're going to now. Is it shifted a few years back, like the earlier part of my career was like house fire, house fire, house fire, and now it's like we don't do a ton of house fires. It's a predominantly wood frame apartment fires now, and they're doing those like crazy. And the ability to see, like, is this an interior seated fire that's spreading via the interior channels, or is it which sometimes it started as that and then it got outside the building and now it's running the exterior of the building, but like, fire showing on the outside of the building, is it interior seated in nature, or is it like actively spreading the exterior? And those are kind of two separate animals, how you might
Yeah.
deal with those. So
Yeah. Yeah, I totally. And this is like something too that I picked up from Jordan, like with our nerd out sessions. But it's like you back to that, make things as simple as possible. Jordan's like, there's like only like 3 places where fires burn. It's like the exterior, it's in the compartment, or it's in a void space. And then there's only a few ways that it spreads. Like goes, outside to in, inside out, and back in, or in the compartment and into the void space, like through it. It's like it's really honestly that simple if you
it is.
if you break it down. So it's like trying to, where did it start is really the big thing. And then, and a lot of times we don't a lot of our fires, we never, especially if you're in an urban setting, like we don't typically move past the compartment fire a lot, and unless, you know, things start going sideways or, you know, weird circumstances. So a lot of times we don't have that, you know, we're not necessarily thinking about that compartment transition to, you know, the exterior up and out, or else you know, breaching the passive fire protection and getting into the void space.
That's an interesting point. I like how you said that, because you're right. Like our kind of bread and butter rhythm that we're defaulted to in those settings is going to be we get on top of them pretty quick and we keep them to contents, you know, and room of origin, so on and so forth. And then applying that same rhythm, that same like expected flow to something that is, you know, left the compartment, running the side of the building, up into the eaves. Like if we're gonna, you know, those are two different fires right there.
Very, very
So
different. Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't really thought about how we like have that baseline rhythm, but then we, you know, you got to get up and you got to change your framework, so to speak, when you're, you know, encountered something that's not that.
And those are typically the fires that end up going sideways, or the ones that are that, you know, outside of the, you know, outside of the norm, or outside of what's predictable, or not predictable, but our perception of what we have when we show up.
Yeah, for sure. And I think a lot of this too, when we talk about auto exposure or inside out, back inside, this also ties back into era as well too, because being working in an older city, uh, one of the things you have to be cognizant of too is even if a building has newer vinyl siding on it, a lot of times it can cover up the asphalt shingles or you know the
Gasoline siding.
gasoline siding, which even that too is understanding that, yeah, this is going to rapidly you know, promote fire spread. It's going to look spectacular, but a lot of that is you know, very superficial fire. It just moves very quickly. And also, like, even when it does impinge on that soffit, knowing the era of the building and how, like, to the extent of the renovations too, a lot of times we're going to be afforded a lot more time in these older buildings because of the solid wood soffits versus the vinyl vented soffits that you're going to see in newer homes. So that's also going to lend into your threat of extension, you know, the inside out, back in, especially with it getting into the attic or the cockloft space.
Yeah, absolutely.
The so the kind of couple questions here about like red flags, some of the building construction red flags. We can probably tie this in with the clusters and anomalies, but um, you know, some of your personal red flags that you have that you like to, you know, make sure that people are aware of, and then the concept of like clusters and anomalies and how we can kind of build our framework using that concept of clusters and anomalies and noting them and what do we do with them. So thoughts on those.
Yeah, I think a big red flag for me is the appearance of multiple units within a single family residential home. I found those are ones where we get jammed up a bit because, you know, we like to think that everything is permitted and done to code, but that's definitely not the case. And then it also kind of speaks to what Jordan talks about a lot is, like, you know, we have this institutional knowledge of how to operate in a house. Like, you know, if I came to either of your guys' house and we're sitting in the living room, I wouldn't have to ask you where the bathroom is. I could just find it based off being in houses for 40 years. But as soon as you throw in the single family home converted to, you know, multifamily, you know, that 4, 6, 8 units, that throws all of the normal layout out. It adds way more void space into it. People become disoriented a lot more in it because of that reduction of that normal layout that we might expect. So that's definitely something that I think about kind of as a red flag for that. Yeah, and then to kind of jump from there to the anomalies part of it, one thing that I always like to talk about with the framework of the era materials and use is you have to be ready for those anomalies. So I use the example that in Vancouver we have a lot of heritage homes. And then we'll have somebody who will, buy a $3 million home and bulldoze it, and then they'll build a new home, but they'll match the design aesthetic to the rest of the houses in the neighborhood. So that's one of those anomalies where you have to be able to adjust. So if I look at a building and my quick size up of it is era, oh, this is a pre-war building. And then I get inside cross the threshold and I'm flowing and my stream is going a long distance, or I end up in an open concept. Well, that's where I have to shift that perspective to think, okay, this is going to be remodeled. I know this is something like that in like BC and Boston, there's a lot of where you'll have the row homes that'll get completely gutted, and then they'll redo them on the inside. So that's kind of fits under that anomaly thing where we have to, that size up doesn't end, on the front lawn. We have to make sure that we're, um, keeping all of our senses when we go inside, and if we do experience any of those anomalies, then we have to be prepared to shift that perspective right away. It could be as simple as like getting in the front door and throwing a hook or a Halligan into the wall to see if you do have that lath and plaster, or those sort of things are really easy ways of maybe having some idea of if it's natural, if your kind of spidey senses are going off at all.
I've always struggled with size up, and everybody's like, oh, size up's important. It's important. And you're like, okay, well, it's always interesting talking to guys about how they use it. Because yes, it is important, but then you get loaded with, oh, you got to coal was wealth, and like all of these, massively it's like this information gathering campaign, and you're like, well, what do I do with all this information I'm supposed to gather? And I like how you're kind of breaking it down, because it's a very usable, like, hey, you're creating your size up process is to create it, and correct me if I'm understanding you wrong here, James, but your size up process is to kind of create your baseline expectation of what you're going to anticipate, and then because of that, when you're defining normal, and then when you are defining normal, you're then able to actually recognize abnormal, because you can't recognize abnormal if you don't already define normal. So you're defining normal, you go in, and then you're like, oh shoot, that's abnormal, big open layout in this what I thought was pre-war, largely compartmentalized building. Okay, now what does those abnormalities mean? And then you're kind of going from there. And I really like how you're breaking that down. Like, that's something that to me that makes the information gathered. Now I can put it to work as opposed to just gathering information.
Yeah, and then back to the kind of the size up is just using that example of the abnormality is there's only so many other options. If you go inside and you're anticipating a pre-war and you're met with open concept, well, that only leaves you one other option. And then as soon as your perspective shifts, then all of a sudden it's like, okay, now I've got to deal with, I probably have lightweight floor systems in this, and I'm going to have an open concept and much more wide open spaces. And if they did the floors and stuff, there's probably going to be drywall. It's not going to be lath and plaster, and the chance of fire penetration from compartment to void space is greater, and all those sorts of things. But it's not like you have to pivot and all of a sudden think of 13 different options now. There's still only 3 options to begin with, and it's really easy to pivot to that perspective.
Yeah, and the key word that Jay used there was anticipation. Once you recognize that you are dealing with something that's been renovated, that's atypical, now your brain can start anticipating and expecting there to be other variables at play here, that this isn't going to follow the typical, pre-war framework, that you need to start gearing yourself up to anticipate these other challenges that you're going to with the newer eras of construction.
Absolutely.
All right, so I'm going to kind of piggyback on this a little bit before we transition to the next topic, but we hit on some of the red flags when it comes to size up, but what are some of the trigger points for you? Because I'm sure there's people that hearing this topic on building construction of this podcast, and especially incident commanders are going to want to hear this. What are some of the signs or the trigger points for you where now you're starting to be fearful, or you're anticipating potential structural compromise?
Yeah, so any transition into the void space, is going to have me start thinking that way. Um, I always and I didn't really mention this earlier, but when we talk about the materials section, I really only focus on wall systems, floor systems, roof systems. That's the parts that are going to collapse, and that's the parts that are going to have fire travel. So if we do start getting fire into those void spaces, then that's where we want to start having some consideration for where we're operating. Like fire into a truss, like a lightweight modern truss roof doesn't mean it's you're gonna have imminent collapse of it. But I definitely want to be aware of where we're operating in the building. But definitely that transition from compartment to void space is something where I'm want to be shifting. Then there's also other elements too. Like this is where you can get further down the rabbit hole of in the United States, it was in the 2012 that the building code changed that required drywall on the underside of lightweight floor systems. Pre 2012, you didn't need it. So there's certain eras, like if there's a 90s home, something that being a building construction nerd, you'd be able to pick out. It's kind of a little bit more nuanced, like definitely going to be thinking about the potential fire spread through that, because someone most likely would have an unfinished basement, and we store all of our stuff down there. And so those are kind of the things, but really that transition from basically from one mode or one area of the building that's on fire into another is definitely something where I to be shifting my thought process. Like if it goes exterior into the compartment or exterior to the void space, compartment into the void space, those are some of the times to take a pause and look at what's going to be happening next.
For sure. All right.
The
So, Jay, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Nick.
No, I was just going to segue into the next one. So if you got a follow up, go for it.
No, I was going to do the same thing because it kind of ties into what we're going to talk about with the LODD investigation stuff. So
yeah, go for it.
Yeah, so the you were involved with the line of duty death investigation with firefighter Jeff Fiala from Hawaii, from Honolulu Fire, and Nick and I were both down there teaching in December, and unfortunately this happened pretty close after Nick and I got back, within a week or two.
January 6th.
So, yeah, and so man, it was you kind of talked about earlier, James, how like if you're an instructor, there should be a little bit of a reverence for the fact that you are teaching people to go out and go operate on the fire ground. And I know for Nick and I both, when that happened, we talked on the phone really quick right after that happened. Like, gosh, man, it's just so tragic, the whole thing, losing a young guy like that, just our hearts broke for the guys and gals down there. And I think from a perspective of somebody who's just down there teaching, like it definitely weighed heavy of like, man, there's a responsibility that should weigh on you if you're somebody who's going out there to teach something, that you're teaching folks to operate in dangerous environments, and to have a respect for that and do your due diligence as an instructor to make sure that you are doing everything you can to, provide folks a framework that's going to be successful and, keep them effective and safe and all that kind of stuff. So can you just kind of talk to us about the experience with that investigation and being a part of the NIOSH investigation and stuff, and like what you learned from it, just kind of your experience as a whole?
Yeah, it was I've told several people, it was probably one of the most impactful things I've ever done in like a professional setting. I initially was asked to go because the early reports was that it was related to a collapse, related to building. That was the initial reason. So I went out there. I got to accompany a great NIOSH investigator, who unfortunately is no longer with NIOSH due to some of the recent cuts they had, and that's a whole other issue. But yeah, I went out there and got to take part in the whole investigation. Sat in every interview with everyone who was on scene. Toured the site, inspected the gear, listened to all the radio transmission, like the whole thing. Something I'd never been a part of before. and I learned so much. The crazy thing about it was that I had just finished my company officer to become a lieutenant, just basically spent a month in training, finished up, and then like a couple days later, hopped on a plane and went out there. So I think my perspective was even different than it would have been a month prior from the whole thing. Just seeing some of the things from the instant commands perspective, and accountability, all that sort of stuff. But I can't say enough about the Honolulu Fire Department. Absolutely amazing people. Everybody that we had the opportunity to interview was just incredible. Yeah, it's crazy to see the vulnerability of everybody, like sharing exactly what happened, and their perspective and their actions in those moments. And yeah, it was a very incredible experience. And I think it's important. And like, I'll be the first to admit, NIOSH is not a perfect system. There's no perfect system. You have the memory issues, unless you're doing it within that 24 to 48-hour range when you're doing interviews. You have the group talk perspective of it, where people are talking ahead of time, and that's going to impact the interviews and that sort of stuff. Not necessarily in a negative way, but just you have to think about all that, and then you have to consider the human factor part of it, and just understand that the stressful events happen, and that can lead to some of the actions that are taken, and that sort of thing. But yeah, it was an incredible experience. um I got to be involved in writing the report as well, like certain portions of it, helping with that. And yeah, really great experience. Definitely have a deep connection with that fire department. I feel it there as a result of it. And yeah, definitely life changing in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I can't say enough about that organization. You talk about culture and true, like a true fraternal organization. I mean, the level of genuine care that they have for one another and the community is second to none. I mean, just being out there was such an experience, and just having them open their doors up to us and treat us as one of their own. It was funny to talk, having conversations with them, and I said, you guys don't even realize what you have here. It's like this is not the norm. The
Hmm.
way that you guys treat each other, the environment that you've fostered here, and it's so far from what's normal and what we're used to experiencing when we go to different places. And I'm not knocking it anywhere else.
Hmm.
There's good and bad everywhere, but by and large, the sense of community there is unreal. So that's why when this happened, especially as close as it was to us being there, had such a like even more profound effect. And
Hmm.
like I said, Jay, like, just to echo Jay's sentiment too, is that again, this is a perfect example of why we're doing this podcast too. Is this is just as much for the fire service as it is for our own growth and development too, and even more so as instructors. Like we have to be even more dialed in, because we have that responsibility of making sure that the messaging that we're conveying to people is not only accurate, but is being conveyed in a manner that it's being received appropriately too. That's the other half of this. We talked about that broken telephone. That's
Yeah.
the medium, and of the communication is just as important as the message itself.
Yeah, and a couple, like I don't know if everybody knows this, but like when NIOSH comes in, like NIOSH is not an organization that just knocks on your door and shows up. They have to be invited to come. And with the Honolulu incident, like the Honolulu Fire Department and the professional Hawaiian firefighters local were 100%, like they wanted it. They wanted to know what happened. They wanted to gain any insights from it. Like I can't say enough about both those organizations with how like willing they were just to take all the information in. And then, the whole thing happened with NIOSH from the political landscape of it. And it was interesting on social media to see people's comments based off it. There was a lot of people that were speaking negatively of NIOSH in those things. And I think there's great value in looking at line of duty deaths and not just line of duty deaths, like looking at close calls, near misses, and learning from those things. Like, you don't have to be reluctant to talk about line of duty deaths to still, share the opinion that we have a job to do and we have to go and get that stuff done. Like those two things can be, aligned together, and we should be looking at it from a balanced perspective. There's LODDs happen. That's the reality of working in the dynamic environment that we do. And if we can look at those reports and take away the things that are applicable to our organization, and apply those things, then that's great. And then just discard the things that don't apply to your organization. That's, not if you work for a department like mine that has close to 1,000 members. If looking at a report from a department that has 20 members is, not a lot, some of those things are not going to be applicable, but we can learn from these things and hopefully, prevent more from happening as best as we can.
Yeah, and I think the inclusion of the human factors is where NIOSH is growing, I think, and I hope they continue to go that way. Where I know we talked about leadership under fire already, but they had a involvement with
The white paper.
yeah, with the white paper, and then also their involvement with Captain Layard's line of duty death, and getting that was really the first time the human factors element has ever been incorporated, which I think we can all agree that that is the most underlooked factor in all of the close call and line of duty death reporting and research and analysis. And that's where I think we need to pay more attention to is taking that aspect of it too, and that's going to help us steer so many things in the right direction in how we translate that to the education piece and how we actually translate those lessons learned into like actionable insights.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I just recently, a few weeks ago, I helped contribute on another NIOSH report that came out of New York State. And one of the things with NIOSH is like for quite a while there was a long backlog where some of the reports were taking 18 months, and the people that are in there now are so passionate about it. They're working so hard. I believe the New York one was like 3 months maybe from the time of the fatality to the report coming out. So they're really working on like making that whole process more efficient and getting the information out in a timely manner, and also just different involvement, like me being involved and asked to help out in certain ways, provide some feedback or review things. They're looking at other sources like that too, which is great.
Yeah, so my department, we our last line of duty death, there was no investigation, no anything. No transparency. I mean, even within the organization, a lot of the guys that were on the job when it happened, it's kind of like when I was new guy hired and stuff, you don't really ask about it. You don't talk about it. Like, you guys don't want to talk about it. It was just kind of a shut thing. And if you develop relationships along the way with guys, and you're able to kind of poke and prod and be like, hey, what happened there? Well, and it feels like you're opening this can of worms. It's like you're not supposed to open that sort of deal. And I've always looked at that and gone like, man, what a lesson for the fire service on why it is so important for us to look into these things, because that line of duty death that we have largely just is in the past and gone, and the lessons to take away from it are pretty much lost because we just kind of buried it and didn't talk about it, which is a tragedy in its own right. And you have like like HFD, those guys are, willing to like, hey, let's go, let's look into this, let's try to be transparent about this and all that kind of stuff, and not, it's not a punitive thing at all. It's a like, I was coaching my kids' lacrosse team this week, and we're talking about it's okay to go. Mistakes are going to happen, but we don't want to be making the same mistakes, over and over again. Like, we have to be able to make a mistake and learn from that mistake, and then move on and hopefully not make that mistake again. And it's just like this concept of, if we bury it, we don't look into it, we don't have, something like NIOSH able to look into this stuff and extrapolate the here's what happened, draw your conclusions. And I think sometimes guys are looking at it like, oh, they're not telling me exactly what I want them to tell me. Like, well, they're not going to, because they're broadcasting it. They're just collecting it, synthesizing it, and then it's your job to take away what there is to learn from it.
Honestly, my perspective on the NIOSH reports are, ignore the contributing factors and the recommendations at the bottom. Like, don't read those things. Like, read through the report, read through the transcript and all of that. Go top to bottom. Make your own assessments based off your organization in the same setting, and then you can look at that stuff after. But I really think that, like, if we looked at it a little bit more from like our personal lens of like, what are the faults that I see based off my lens and my experience in my organization. That's, I think that it's really useful in that way, rather than just, somebody telling me what the recommendations are. And they put a lot of time into looking at industry best practice and standards that are out there to develop those recommendations. But I think there's a lot of value in doing the kind of the mental exercise of looking at that in your own way.
Well, it's the same thing with UL stuff. I mean, when UL put something out, it's they'll have, here's some of the key recommendations or tactical recommendations or whatever. And, some people love them, some people hate them, whatever. And like, same thing. It's a lot of information. And instead of just skipping right to the tactical recommendations portion and being like, okay, I've read the report. Like, no, you haven't. You just went straight to the end, read some cliff notes, and then formulated an opinion based off of how you'd like those cliff notes. You got to kind of take all of the information and then look at it, like you said, through the lens of your organization and draw your own, which takes work. That just takes a lot of work.
Well, yeah, I have a friend who works for a large organization in California who had some interaction with FSRI and had some concerns that he vocalized, and they basically said, like, hey, your organization is not the norm. Like, a department of 15, 16, 1,800 people is not the majority of the North American Fire Service. You are the small percentage of it. So, and I think, like, when he was telling me that, I was like, oh yeah, it's like you have to view things through the lens of, like, any information like that being applicable from, a small volunteer that maybe has 20, 30 guys to, the largest organization in the North America. So.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so Jay, with that, any closing remarks for James?
No, man, super dense, rich, just a lot of information, a lot of great stuff, James. And I mean, this one I've been looking forward to for a long time, and definitely made my gears turn for sure. And it's one of those, like, we could go on for 3 hours pulling on threads, but no, really appreciative of your time, and man, such a great resource for the fire service, and definitely appreciate what you're doing, getting involved with NIOSH and stuff. You're the right guy for the job, and look forward to seeing what you're able to continue to do on that front.
Yeah, I appreciate that. If I can throw one plug out, I had the opportunity this past year. There was a grant that was secured through the International Association of Firefighters, and I helped develop a online building construction class that is based on that framework that we talked about. It'll be launched in September. online for free. You don't have to be an IAFF member. Anybody can take it. That was one of the big things. And it'll just be an online course that goes through all of this stuff, the era, the materials, the use, and ties it to a bunch of the FSRI stuff. And so that'll be live in September, hopefully September 1st. So if you want to know more about this, or have an interest in it, look for that course in September. And like I said, it's free to anyone. That was kind of the reason why I jumped at the opportunity, was to make it accessible to the entire fire service and have it out there. So
That's great that's great to hear, because the first time I got to hear you speak was at the P&W Fire Conference the other year in the Pacific Northwest, and you totally blew my mind on a few things, and again, just talking about dispelling a lot of the misconceptions that we talked about here today. And I knew that you were one of the first names that got thrown around when Jay and I were putting this podcast together for that reason. So I'm thrilled to hear that your information is gonna be readily accessible to the masses. That's really great to hear. So James,
awesome.
I can't thank you enough for taking your time out to share your expertise with our listeners. And with that, to our listeners, thank you for tuning in, and make sure to look out for our next episode of the Framework Podcast. Hopefully we can wrangle Jordan Legan and segue this conversation into talking about the specific layouts and orientation. So with that, everybody, take care and stay frosty.